Welcome back, everyone. For this deep dive, you've sent in a massive amount of research and articles all about Star Wars, the Clone Wars.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to take a deep dive into this animated series and really kind of look at it from a media studies perspective.
Sounds good.
So we're talking about the narrative, we're talking about the visual style, the cultural impact, all that good stuff. We're going way beyond just lightsabers and space battles here,
Right.
and really trying to understand what makes this show tick and why it matters.
Cool.
And one of the things that really caught my eye as I was going through all this material was
Yeah.
one of the articles even compares the animation style to marionettes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we're going to have to dig into that a little bit later.
Yeah, I'm really curious about that. It's interesting because this show might seem like it's for kids at first glance,
Mm-hmm.
but it actually tackles some really complex themes. Um, we're talking about the morality of war, the clones struggling with their identity,
Yeah.
even some pretty subtle political commentary that you might not expect.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that stood out to me was how the Clone Wars bridges the gap between Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It really fleshes out those 3 years that are so crucial to Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side.
Right.
But the movies just don't have the time to delve into all of that.
It's true. And by filling in those gaps, the Clone Wars kind of adds this whole new dimension to the prequel trilogy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just about what happened, but it's about, why it happened. We see the characters, making these choices, facing challenges, experiencing the consequences in a way that the movies just couldn't fully explore.
Right, so we've got this show that's exploring war, identity, politics, all this pretty heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still Star Wars.
Yes.
So there's got to be some action and adventure in there, right?
Oh, absolutely. But even the action sequences are used to explore some deeper themes.
Okay.
Take the Umbara arc, for example.
Oh, yeah.
It's visually stunning.
Okay.
With these really intense battles, this kind of shadowy, almost claustrophobic environment. But it also really delves into, the psychological toll that war takes on the clones.
Yeah.
Forcing them to question their loyalty and make these really difficult choices.
Okay, so the Umbara arc sounds pretty dark. It
It's,
makes me wonder, how does the Clone Wars balance those darker themes with the fact that it's still technically a show that kids can watch?
well, one thing that I noticed as I was going through all this material was that the show seems to kind of mature along with its audience.
Oh, interesting.
So, the earlier seasons might be a bit more lighthearted,
Mm-hmm.
but as the series progresses, it starts to tackle these increasingly complex and challenging themes.
Right.
It's almost like the showrunners kind of understood that their audience was growing up along with the series
Yeah.
and were ready to engage with more mature content.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also really curious about Ahsoka Tano. She's mentioned a lot in the material that we've got, and she seems like a really key character in the series. What makes her so compelling?
Well, she starts out as Anakin's Padawan, basically his apprentice
Okay.
in the Jedi Order. But over time, she really evolves into this strong, independent figure who challenges the Jedi's beliefs and ends up making a decision that really kind of shakes things up.
Wait, she leaves the Jedi Order.
She does.
What leads her to that? I mean, does it undermine the Jedi too much?
Well, I think her choice kind of exposes some of the flaws within the Jedi Order itself, something that the movies only hint at.
Right.
For example, Jedi Council can often come across as very rigid and inflexible, especially when it comes to their emotions.
Okay, yeah.
And Ahsoka's journey kind of forces us to question whether their way is always the right way.
Interesting. It's like the Clone Wars is giving us this different perspective on the Jedi, one that's more nuanced and complex than what we see in the movies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this series so compelling. It takes these familiar elements from the Star Wars universe and explores them in a way that's both thought-provoking and entertaining.
Right, so we've talked about the story, we've talked about the characters, but I have to bring up the animation style.
Oh, yeah, let's talk about that.
It's described as a blend of anime and dot marionettes.
Yeah.
That's a combination I was not expecting.
It's kind of out there, right?
Yeah.
So the creators specifically wanted to avoid photorealism.
Okay.
They were going for a more stylized look, something that really emphasized design and movement. And believe it or not, the inspiration for that actually came partly from old marionette shows, like Thunderbirds.
I can kind of see that now that you mention it. The characters do move in a way that's a bit dot puppet-like.
It's true.
But it's not creepy or anything. It's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, it's unique.
Yeah, and there's a quote from George Lucas where he says, "Animation is our art."
I love that quote.
Like emphasizing that it's not about just trying to perfectly mimic real life, it's about expression.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think the Clone Wars really embodies that philosophy.
I agree.
It definitely stands out from other animation styles of the time. But I did read that it got some mixed reviews.
Oh, really?
Some critics even compared the characters to Plato or Pinocchio.
Well, you know, some people definitely found the style a bit jarring, especially in those early seasons.
Yeah.
There was kind of a learning curve, I think,
Right.
for sure. But the creators really refined it over time.
Yeah.
And, there's always going to be some resistance to anything that's like new and different, right?
That's true. I mean, look at the prequels themselves.
Oh, yeah.
They were pretty divisive when they first came out, but now there's a whole generation of fans who grew up with those movies and have a real appreciation for them.
I think that's true.
Yeah, I think maybe the same thing's happening with the Clone Wars.
Could be.
The animation style might have been a stumbling block for some viewers initially, but... Right.
The show's storytelling, the characters, the themes, it's all resonated with such a wide audience that it's become like this beloved part of the Star Wars canon.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about how the Clone Wars kind of fits into that prequel trilogy timeline.
Right.
But how does it connect to the larger Star Wars universe?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like a self-contained story, is it?
No, it's not at all. This is a prime example of what we call transmedia storytelling.
Oh, okay.
So the Clone Wars expands on the movies, but it also connects to other shows like Rebels, The
Wow.
Mandalorian, even the comics, the novels. It's all part of this massive interconnected narrative.
So it's like each piece of Star Wars media, whether
Yeah.
it's a movie, a TV show, a book, whatever,
Right.
adds another layer to this constantly evolving story.
Exactly. And the Clone Wars plays a really crucial role in that.
Okay.
It introduces characters, it establishes events, it explores themes that actually have a ripple effect throughout the entire franchise. One thing that really caught my eye in all this material is how the show handles gender representation.
Okay.
It seems to go beyond that classic hero and damsel in distress trope.
It does, yeah. That's a great observation. One of the things I think makes the Clone Wars so interesting is this more nuanced portrayal of masculinity and femininity.
Okay.
Like, look at characters like, Kanan Jarrus, the Jedi Knight, who leads the rebellion in Star Wars Rebels.
Yeah.
Ezra Bridger, his Padawan, who struggles with the dark side.
Mm.
Zeberillios, the muscle of their crew.
Okay.
Hera Syndulla, their pilot and leader.
Right.
And Sabine Wren, the Mandalorian artist and explosives expert.
Mm.
These characters, show a range of masculine and feminine qualities, and they kind of challenge those old stereotypes.
Yeah, Hera especially seems like a
Yeah.
great example. The research mentions that she's not just a skilled pilot, but she's also this strategic leader
Yes.
and kind of mother figure to her crew. That's a pretty powerful combination.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think it reflects how our understanding of gender roles has kind of evolved.
Mm-hmm.
They become more complex and fluid.
Mm-hmm.
And the Clone Wars, even though it's set in this galaxy far, far away,
Right.
manages to reflect those contemporary ideas in a way that feels both natural and insightful.
So we've talked about the show's more mature themes.
Yeah.
But there's one that always comes up with shows like this, especially those aimed at a younger audience. Violence.
The big one, yeah.
It is a war story, after all. How does the Clone Wars kind of deal with that?
That's a really important question, especially given the ongoing debate about the impact of media violence, particularly on children. There's been a lot of research on that.
Yeah.
And some studies suggest there might be a link between exposure to violence in media and increased aggression in real life.
So how does the Clone Wars navigate this? Does it try to downplay the violence, or does it present a more realistic view of war?
It definitely doesn't shy away from showing the brutality of war.
Okay.
Battles can be intense. And characters, do get hurt, sometimes fatally.
Yeah.
But it also portrays, the emotional toll that violence takes on everyone involved,
Yeah.
including the clones, who are literally bred for war.
I'm starting to see that the Clone Wars isn't just this simple good guys versus bad guys story.
It's just so much more than that.
It's more about the gray areas, the moral complexities, the impact that conflict has on everyone, regardless of which side they're on.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why the show has resonated so strongly with viewers.
Yeah.
It doesn't offer easy answers or simplistic solutions.
Right.
Instead, it presents a much more nuanced and, I think, realistic view of war and its consequences.
So we've established that the Clone Wars is pretty complex and thought-provoking.
Yes.
But with all the changes to the Star Wars canon over the years, especially with Disney taking over,
Right.
where does this show stand? Is it still considered a crucial part of the story?
Oh, absolutely. Even though Disney introduced a new canon back in 2014, The Clone Wars is still essential viewing for any Star Wars fan.
Okay.
It really fleshes out characters and events and themes that have a direct impact on later stories, even those set like decades later. Take Ahsoka, for example.
Yeah.
Her story begins in The Clone Wars, but she goes on to appear in Rebels. The Mandalorian
Right.
even has her own live-action series now.
Wow, so her journey really spans multiple eras of the Star Wars timeline.
It does.
So I guess that makes the Clone Wars even more important because it lays the groundwork for these characters and storylines that continue to be relevant even today.
Precisely. It's not just about filling in gaps, it's about building those foundations.
Right.
And that's what makes it such a valuable part of the Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
It's not just supplemental material. It's integral to understanding the larger saga.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about how the Clone Wars bridges that prequel trilogy, tackles all these mature themes, features this unique animation style, and even connects to the larger Star Wars universe. But it feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
I know, right? There's so much more.
There's so much more to explore.
And that's what makes it so rewarding to kind of dive into.
Yeah.
We haven't even touched on the political commentary, the exploration of like individual autonomy, the emotional depth of the characters. There's a whole universe of ideas waiting to be uncovered.
Well, I'm definitely ready to keep digging.
Me too.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is really fascinating is how the show kind of explores this idea of individuality, especially when it comes to the clones.
Yeah.
On the surface, they're all genetically identical soldiers,
Right.
bred for war, right?
Yeah.
But as the series goes on, it really starts to like pick apart what that really means.
That idea of the clones being born into service always kind of struck me as a little unsettling. It raises some big questions about free will and whether they really have any control over their destiny.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely makes you think. And it's not just like a theoretical question.
Right.
The show actually puts the clones in situations where they have to confront those issues head on.
Do you have a specific example? Like a storyline or a character arc that really kind of delves into those themes?
Well, actually, the Umbera arc that we talked about earlier is a great example of this.
Okay.
Not only is it visually stunning, but it forces the clones under Captain Rex's command to deal with this Jedi general, Pong Krell.
Oh, right.
Who's really reckless and kind of seems to just disregard their lives.
Yeah.
So they're really forced to question their loyalty and make some tough choices.
Now that you mention it, I do remember reading something about a Jedi general who was particularly harsh on the clones.
Yeah.
Didn't he end up turning on the Republic or something?
Yes, he does. That's Pong Krell. And he actually becomes disillusioned with the Jedi and the Republic and ends up betraying them.
Wow.
It's a really interesting arc because it shows how the war is affecting everyone.
Right.
Even the Jedi.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense that even the Jedi wouldn't be immune to the pressures and the horrors of war.
Right.
And seeing that play out through a character like Pong Krell just adds another layer of complexity to the conflict.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as good versus evil, is it?
Not at all. The Clone Wars does a great job of blurring those lines.
Yeah.
And showing that there are shades of gray on both sides.
Yeah.
And the clones are caught right in the middle of it all.
Speaking of those gray areas, you mentioned earlier that the Clone Wars has some political commentary kind of woven in. What exactly does that look like? I mean, it's a space opera with laser swords and giant robots.
Right.
How deep can the politics really go?
I mean, remember, the Galactic Republic is in the middle of a civil war. And as the series goes on, we start to see how that war is really kind of eroding the Republic's values and institutions. There's corruption, there's warmongering, there's manipulation of public opinion. Does any of that sound familiar?
Whoa, I never really made that connection before. You're right. Those are all things that we see happening in the real world, too.
Exactly.
It's like the show is holding up a mirror to our own political systems.
I think so.
Yeah.
And it does it in a way that's not preachy or heavy-handed.
Right.
It's kind of woven into the narrative organically, so it allows viewers to draw their own conclusions.
So we've got the war, the clones struggling with their identity, this underlying political commentary. It's starting to feel like the Clone Wars is a lot more sophisticated than I initially realized.
It really is. And it's not just about, like, the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
The show also really excels at exploring, like, the personal stories of its characters.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, we talked about Ahsoka earlier and how her journey kind of challenges our perceptions of the Jedi. Are there any other characters whose stories really resonated with you?
Well, Captain Rex is a great example. He's a clone trooper who serves under Anakin Skywalker.
Okay.
And he becomes, like, a really complex and well-developed character.
Right.
We see him struggling with his loyalty to the Republic, his duty to his brothers, and even his own sense of individuality.
That makes me think back to those questions we were discussing earlier about the clones and free will.
Yeah.
Does Rex ever, like, openly defy orders? Or is he aware about finding ways to operate within the system while still retaining his own sense of morality?
I think he walks a very fine line. You know, he's definitely a loyal soldier, but he's also not afraid to question orders or speak up when he thinks something is wrong.
Right.
And as the war goes on, we see him becoming more and more disillusioned with the conflict and the toll it's taking on his brothers.
It's interesting how the show manages to give these clones, who are all genetically identical, such distinct personalities.
It is, yeah.
Like, you really feel like you get to know them as individuals, even though they all look the same.
The writers did a brilliant job of finding ways to differentiate the clones.
Yeah.
Not just through their dialogue, but also through, like, their actions, their relationships with each other, even their, like, little quirks and mannerisms.
I guess it goes back to that idea of challenging assumptions.
Yeah.
Just because they're clones, it doesn't mean they're all mindless drones.
No.
They have thoughts, they have feelings, that they have these individual experiences that shape who they are.
And the show really leans into that.
Yeah.
It forces us to see them as individuals, not just as interchangeable soldiers. It humanizes them in a way that's, like, really powerful.
I'm noticing a pattern here.
What's that?
So the show challenges our perceptions of the Jedi.
Right.
It makes us think about the ethics of war and the political systems that lead to conflict. And it even forces us to confront our assumptions about individuality and free will. It's almost like the Clone Wars is asking us to question everything we thought we knew about Star Wars.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's what makes it so much more than, like, just a kid's show or just a simple action-adventure story. You know, it's a nuanced and thought-provoking exploration of some really complex themes, all kind of wrapped up in this incredibly engaging and entertaining package.
Okay, let's circle back to the animation style for a minute.
Okay.
We talked about how it's inspired by anime and marionettes.
Right.
But I'm curious about how the creators actually used that style to tell the story. Did it affect, like, the pacing, the action sequences, or even, like, the emotional tone of the show?
Oh, absolutely. The animation style isn't just about aesthetics. It's a storytelling tool.
Okay.
For example, you know, the use of dynamic camera angles and, like, fast-paced editing in the action sequences really amps up the excitement and the intensity.
Well, it's like they're using the animation to enhance the storytelling.
Yeah.
Rather than just trying to create, like, pretty picture.
Exactly. And they're not afraid to experiment either.
All right.
Like, some episodes have a more stylized look, almost like a moving comic book, while others are more realistic and gritty.
Right.
You know, it all depends on the needs of the story they're telling.
That's really cool. I love how they're, like, using animation to push the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah.
It's not just about mimicking live action. It's about creating, like, a unique and engaging visual experience.
And it's not just about, like, the big flashy moments either.
Right.
The animation style also allows for some, like, really subtle and nuanced emotional expressions.
Oh, okay.
You can see it in, like, the way a character's eyes move or, like, the slight tremble in their voice.
Yeah.
It adds a whole other layer of depth to the storytelling.
Now that you mention it, I do remember reading that the animation team, like, paid really close attention to the characters' facial expressions,
Yes.
their body language. They really wanted to make sure that even though these characters were animated, they still felt real and relatable.
And I think they succeeded brilliantly.
Yeah.
You really connect with these characters on an emotional level, even though they're not real people.
It's like they've managed to capture, like, the essence of humanity within these animated characters.
I agree.
Their struggles, their triumphs, their hopes, their fears.
Yeah.
It all feels so real and relatable.
And it's not just the individual characters either. The animation style also helps create like a sense of scale and scope that would be really difficult to achieve in live action.
Oh, okay.
The battles are epic.
Yeah.
The landscapes are breathtaking. The special effects are just like mind-blowing.
It really sounds like they've managed to strike like this perfect balance between the intimate and the epic.
I think so.
They can zoom in on a character's face and convey like a world of emotion.
Yeah.
And then pull back to show this massive space battle with hundreds of ships.
I know.
It's pretty impressive.
It is. And I think it's a real testament to like the talent and creativity of the artists and animators who worked on the show.
Yeah.
They really pushed the boundaries of what animation could do. And I think they created something truly special in the process.
We keep talking about how the Clone Wars challenges expectations, but I think what I'm realizing now is that it's not just about like subverting tropes or like surprising the audience.
Yeah.
It's about exploring these complex and often uncomfortable truths about war, politics, the human condition. It's almost like the Clone Wars is sneaking in some really profound ideas under the guise of this like fun, action-packed space opera.
And it's working. I mean, people are connecting with this show on a deeper level than I think anyone probably expected.
I agree. And I think it's a testament to the power of storytelling.
Yeah.
When you have a compelling narrative, relatable characters, and a world that feels both familiar and fantastical, you can really get people to engage with some big ideas.
I think so.
Okay, so we've talked about the show's animation, the characters, the themes, even the political commentary.
Yeah. But we haven't really touched on like the legacy of the Clone Wars.
Okay.
I mean, it ran for 7 seasons.
7 is a long time.
And it's had this huge impact on the Star Wars franchise.
It has.
What do you think its lasting legacy will be?
That's a great question. I think one of the most significant aspects of its legacy is how it really expanded the Star Wars universe.
Okay.
And introduced like a whole new generation of fans to the saga.
Right.
It proved that Star Wars stories could be told in different mediums and could appeal to a much wider audience.
Yeah, it's not just about the movies anymore.
No, not at all.
The Clone Wars really helped to pave the way for all the amazing Star Wars TV shows that we have today.
It's true. And it's not just about like quantity, it's also about quality. The Clone Wars really set a high bar for storytelling and animation in the Star Wars universe. It proved that these stories could be complex, nuanced, emotionally resonant,
And I'm also thinking about the characters, like Ahsoka Tano in particular has become like this huge fan favorite.
Yeah.
And her journey has continued far beyond the Clone Wars. She's become this iconic figure who represents hope, resilience, staying true to your values.
She's definitely left a mark. And it's not just Ahsoka, Captain Rex, Maul, Hondo Anaka, Cad Bane. So many characters from the Clone Wars have become like these fan favorites and have continued to appear in other Star Wars stories.
It's almost like the Clone Wars created this whole new ecosystem of characters and storylines that continue to enrich the Star Wars universe.
Exactly. It's like this gift that keeps on giving.
I'm also curious about the show's impact, like on the animation industry as a whole.
Okay.
Do you think it had any influence on the way other animated shows are made?
I think so. The Clone Wars demonstrated that animation could be used to tell really complex and mature stories that, like, rivaled live-action television and film, and it showed that audiences were hungry for that kind of content.
I think it's safe to say that the Clone Wars was a game changer.
It really pushed the boundaries of animation, of storytelling, of what it meant to be, like, a Star Wars fan. And its legacy will continue to be felt for years to come.
Absolutely.
As we've been talking about all these big, complex themes, I've been thinking about something.
Okay.
The Clone Wars isn't just about these massive battles and the political schemes and even the fate of the galaxy. It's also about those, like, smaller, more personal moments that show us what it's like to, live in a world at war.
What I think is so fascinating is how the show doesn't shy away from portraying like the emotional toll that war takes on everyone, not just the soldiers on the front lines.
Yeah.
We see characters like grappling with grief, trauma, those moral dilemmas that like inevitably arise in times of conflict.
Yeah, the Umbara arc we've mentioned a couple times really stands out in my mind.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's not just a visually impressive action sequence. It's like a deep dive into the psychological impact of war on the clones. To see them questioning their loyalty, dealing with a leader who seems to just disregard their lives.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff.
The Umbara arc is such a good example of how the Clone Wars really goes beyond that, like, typical good versus evil narrative.
Yeah.
It forces us to kind of confront this uncomfortable reality that there are no easy answers in war.
Right.
Sometimes even the quote-unquote good guys make mistakes.
Yeah.
And the lines between right and wrong get really blurred.
It makes you think about the real-world implications, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Wars aren't just fought on battlefields.
Right.
They're fought in the hearts and minds of the people who were caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And the Clone Wars really doesn't shy away from exploring those complexities.
Mm-hmm.
It shows us the human cost of war, the sacrifices that are made,
Right.
the scars that are left behind.
It's like the show is reminding us that even in a galaxy far, far away, war is this brutal and messy affair.
Yeah.
There are no winners, only survivors.
And even the survivors, I think, carry those scars with them long after the fighting has ended.
One of the things that struck me as we've been talking is how the Clone Wars seems to be playing with this idea of legacy.
Okay.
We see characters like Anakin and Obi-Wan wrestling with the weight of like their past actions and the impact they'll have on the future. It's like they're trying to figure out where they fit into this like grand sweeping saga.
I think that's a theme that like runs throughout the entire Star Wars saga. But I think the Clone Wars explores it in a particularly poignant way.
Yeah.
We know how Anakin's story ends.
Right.
But the show gives us this glimpse into like his internal struggles, his fears, his vulnerabilities.
Right.
We see like the seeds of his downfall being sown.
Yeah.
But we also see his moments of heroism,
Yeah.
his compassion, his genuine desire to do good.
It's almost tragic in a way. We know what's coming, but we can't help but root for him, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he'll find a way to break free from his destiny.
And I think that's the beauty of the Clone Wars.
Yeah.
It adds this depth and nuance to characters we thought we already knew.
Right.
It like humanizes them, showing us their flaws, their struggles, their moments of grace.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even like the most iconic figures in the Star Wars universe are ultimately just people trying to make sense of this like complicated and often dangerous world.
It's funny, we started this deep dive talking about how the Clone Wars connects to the movies.
Right.
But it feels like it's become so much more than that.
I agree.
It's almost like this separate entity, like a parallel universe that's enriching and expanding the Star Wars saga in ways that I don't think anyone could have anticipated.
It's definitely taken on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And I think that's a testament to like the creativity and passion of the people who made it. They took this like relatively small window in the Star Wars timeline and turned it into this sprawling epic that's full of action, adventure, drama, heart.
We've talked about how the Clone Wars has impacted the Star Wars franchise.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about its broader like cultural influence. Has it like changed the way we think about things like war, technology, or even gender roles?
I think it's definitely contributed to those like ongoing conversations about those issues. For example, the show's portrayal of the clones.
Yeah.
Raises questions about the ethics of genetic engineering,
Right.
the use of artificial intelligence in warfare.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about those concepts in like a science fiction novel, but to see them brought to life in such a like visceral and emotionally resonant way really makes you think about the implications.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the clones.
Right.
The show's exploration of political corruption, the manipulation of media, the rise of authoritarianism feels like eerily relevant to the world we live in today.
It's like the show is holding up this mirror to our own society and asking us to examine our own values and beliefs.
And it's doing it in a way that's like engaging and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Without being preachy or heavy-handed.
I think one of the most important aspects of the Clone Wars is how it portrays like our female characters. We see women in positions of power, women who are skilled warriors, and women who are like these complex and multifaceted individuals.
It's such a refreshing change from that like stereotypical damsel in distress trope that we see so often in like action adventure stories.
Right.
The women in the Clone Wars are active participants in the story.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid to challenge the status quo.
I'm thinking about Ahsoka Tano, of course, but
Yeah.
also characters like Padme Amidala,
Right.
who's like this skilled politician and diplomat, and Asajj Ventress, who's this powerful dark side warrior.
Yeah.
They're all strong, capable women
They are.
who defy like easy categorization.
And they're not just there to be like love interests or sidekicks
Okay.
either. They have their own motivations, their own goals, their own journeys.
Right.
They're like fully realized characters who contribute to the story in really meaningful ways.
It's a really powerful message, especially for like younger viewers
Oh, for
who
sure.
are still forming their own ideas about gender roles and like what's possible for women.
It's a reminder that women can be heroes,
Yeah.
leaders, agents of change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Clone Wars,
Okay.
what's the takeaway for our listener? What should they be thinking about as they like revisit the series or maybe experience it for the first time?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the Clone Wars is so much more than just a Star Wars story.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of our own world, our own struggles,
Right.
our own capacity for both good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story about the power of choice,
Yeah.
the importance of compassion, and the enduring hope that even in like the darkest of times, light will always find a way to shine through.
It's a reminder that even in a galaxy far, far away,
The things that matter most
right.
are the connections we make,
Yeah.
the choices we make, and the legacy we leave behind.
So dive into the Clone Wars,
Yes.
explore its depths, let it challenge you, inspire you,
Yeah.
and remind you of the power of storytelling to connect us all.
And may the Force be with you, always.